Imagine an island, windless, still, so hot that you can't even go to the beach. For 180 years, people have been fighting over water. In many places, most of the water is privately owned. People pray for rain because they live surrounded by invasive dry grasses. 97% of the counties are suffering from drought. You are living in a tinderbox, one spark away from tragedy at all times. This is Hawaii, Maui. Sold to tourists as paradise, listed by the EPA in 2021 as one of the best places to live to survive environmental disaster. Climate resiliency is quite an attractive feature. Maybe this is why Hawaii lives in the headlines as a home away from home for the ultra-wealthy. Mark Zuckerberg even has an apocalypse bunker here. This is where we are when the fires in Lahaina happen. The former capital of a nation, gone in one day. I'm Khara Jabola-Carolus. Welcome back to episode 2 of the Feminist by Design podcast, a series where we explore what our world could look like if feminists were its architects. In episode 1, we talked about Palestine and power. We examined the systems truly at play in this conflict, not the ones that are immediately visible, but the entangled issues around domination, language, and profit. And we explained why solutions born of a patriarchal mindset aren't the answer to patriarchy-created problems. We also talked about how being a woman leader, say the CEO of a weapons company, doesn't make you a feminist. The heart of feminism is asking, who really is in control here? Who is benefiting? Feminism, as we see it, is a practice. We mentioned last time that these systems are at their most vulnerable when people are at their most vulnerable. And that is happening right now on Maui. Immediately after the fires, there was a communications blackout. No way to contact anyone. A lack of information in or out. A lack of anything in or out. There is only one road that goes in and out of Lahaina. Already in a housing crisis from tourism, residents are left with nothing and nowhere to go. Everything is gray, burned, until you get to the golf courses. Those are still green. So far, 100 people have been confirmed dead from the fire. The tourism didn't stop, but the people still need shelter, transportation, water, help. There is a Hollywood expectation that many of us have that when disaster strikes, the government, the military, will be there immediately and help. But that is not how the system in reality is designed. And in Lahaina, the community stepped up. And that is what I want us to pay attention to for a moment, because Lahaina saved itself. Cross-cultural solidarity, community self-determination, feminists prioritizing reproductive care, women's safety, the community skillfully organizing to focus on rebuilding and staying ahead of disaster capitalism. People put their personal crisis on pause to focus on the good of the community, and we can learn from this. But if the community had been in control from the beginning of the land and the water, this fire never would have happened.
So I guess we could focus on Lahaina because it was the epicenter of Maui and all of Hawaii.
That's Kaniela Ng. I met him when I was a law student fighting against a for-profit prison. He's an Indigenous Native Hawaiian organizer from Maui, national director of the Green New Deal Network, and co-founder of Our Hawaii, a movement to create a Hawaii that puts local residents and Hawaiians, not big money interests, first. He's a proud feminist, and he's also my partner.
It wasn't always the dry, fire-prone region that it is today. Historically, it was a wetland, and there would be boats circling around the famous Waiоla Church every Sunday.
So how did Lahaina go from lush wetlands to a suffocating desert overrun by dry, invasive grasses? Would you believe me if I said that part of the story starts with snow?
Growing up, I was in a elementary school where during recess, it would rain what we called black snow. And that was the ash from sugarcane. So sugar was a dominant crop growing up. It took at least a third of our island, maybe half. And in order to harvest them, they would have to burn it. And the environmental and health impacts of that was severe. A lot of us had asthma growing up, and we couldn't quite explain why. As kids, you're like, oh, this is fun. There's black stuff in the sky. But as you get older, you realize it's very harmful.
That's such a striking mental image for me.
That's our producer, Elizabeth Nakano.
What did it smell like?
Oh, I could smell it. Just with the question, I could smell it. It's one of the things you can't forget. It's not quite. It's not like burning grass, like kind of like that nice smell of like sage, and it's not rubber. It's somewhere in between. It's definitely like the pesticides burning that really makes it unique.
For most of its history, Hawaii was a nation governed by Native Hawaiians, a sovereign nation with relationships with other countries. But in 1893, something shocking happened. A group of US-backed white supremacists pulled off a successful coup d'etat of the Hawaiian government. Many consider this the first American occupation of a foreign nation. Some of the conspirators had family histories as plantation owners in the southern US and were even Confederate veterans. These were the losers of the Civil War, opportunists who wanted to establish power by recreating a plantation economy in Hawaii. Sexism also played a huge role in their belief that the Hawaiian government needed to be overthrown. Hawaii's head of state at that time, Queen Liliuokalani, was a brown woman who could think for herself. The hostile Americans considered her leadership ridiculous. Many in the U.S. saw the seizing of Hawaii as a business strategy. Others saw it as imperialism, and it was an extremely polarizing idea. The politicians and voters who were against it at the time were so intensely against imperialism that they formed a nationwide organization of anti-imperialists to fight the contemporaneous annexation of the Philippines. Yes, at the same time that this is happening in Hawaii, it is also happening in the Philippines. You'll hear more about that in our next episode. But back to the US. You had the anti-imperialists, and then you had people who were pro-imperialist. They claimed the term proudly. A divided public, hyper-polarized, sounds familiar. Without the consent of the governed, Congress voted to take Hawaii. Non-Hawaiians settled in to erase and replace Native Hawaiians. Hawaiian language was banned. Plantation owners consolidated power to remake and take over all institutions and land. The U.S. military claimed 25% of Oahu for bases. This continued until there were more Native Hawaiians outside of the islands than here. Today, we call that settler colonialism.
And it didn't just start with sugar. When Western capitalism arrived on our shores, it started in the whaling industry for oils, for lamps, and everything else. And they almost eradicated the whales. And then it was sandalwood, and then they essentially eradicated the trees here. And then it just kind of kept going. And I think after sugar, it was tourism, and we're seeing the same sort of extractive practices for tourism. But every time it gets replaced and it's something new, we still see the same sorts of environmental, social, and health impacts that arise.
So even before the fire started, capitalist approaches to land management were diverting water, monopolizing resources, and fundamentally changing island ecosystems to serve industry and to put profit over people. So what's the through line to present-day Lahaina?
Well, first of all, the sugar barons needed water to irrigate their crops. And when some of those crops failed and they realized that developing this land into subdivisions or businesses would be more profitable, that still required water. The hotels across Kaanapali on the west side of Maui need lots and lots of water. So they went and used their political influence to create laws that essentially direct 75% of these public waters to business use and then 25% to communities. So when you see these news reports about how there's a drought on Maui and people are getting fined $500 for watering their lawns while the golf courses are very green and the pools and the water slides are still happening in all these hotels, that's why. It's because of those policies and systems in place that stem way back to the original plantation days.
Looking at this bigger picture helps you to begin to understand that what caused the fires was a short-sighted, man-made system. Our economic system is designed to require plunder. And I want to say that again. Our economic system, by design, requires plunder. And this means that you, everyone, is likely vulnerable to your own Lahaina. A fire starts. No water to put out the fire. No cell service for 5 days. No significant form of formal aid for 5 to 6 weeks. Even if you live in the United States, even if your area is surrounded by friendly military bases with Marines and special forces, even if millions of relief dollars are committed by major humanitarian organizations and donors, even if people stand with you in solidarity online. And what's interesting to me is that the same value system, economic and political system that started the fire is a system that we're supposed to trust to fix it. When the truth is, it's actually set up to make the situation even worse for locals and better for outsiders. After large-scale disasters, groups with money and influence mine the wreckage for new business opportunities. This is disaster capitalism. A developer will get a loan to buy up tons of burned properties for pennies on the dollar, for example. Or a major hotel chain with empty rooms will charge $1,000 per day per room and take millions of tax and philanthropy dollars to house displaced survivors. These groups don't present themselves as profiteers, but they are. And in the process of cutting deals and figuring out how to make the most money from the situation, the affected community is left worse off. Lahaina is fighting back.
It's really clear where the folks in Lahaina stand. The idea that only 25% of the water in Lahaina gets to stay within the people of Lahaina is something that is not popular and in dispute now. The good news is there are similar fights on East Maui and Central Maui where the community actually won, and it was a combination of tactics strategically linked through policy battles, cultural shifts, media shifts, and of course legal, that were all supported by some really wise philanthropists. I do feel like if the folks that have been leading that work weren't in the picture, then yes, I think we would have seen a lot of the folks in power remain in power and have incentives to continue this sort of thing. But now that people are sort of joining together, standing up and speaking out, things are starting to shift.
It's this very sophisticated, rooted community organizing model in a disaster context that we should be paying attention to, because it's about asserting our right to shape the future, not just react to the past. People of color, working class communities should not be relegated to cleaning up the mess after environmental disasters. There are so many examples of this, like military jet fuel on Oahu, where I live, in the water system. And this led to mostly women and children being hospitalized. Petroleum exposure is also linked to miscarriage. This wouldn't happen if the system that controls the water was feminist by design. An intersectional approach to disaster asks, how are women affected by a particular decision or program or policy? How are Native Hawaiians affected? How are undocumented people affected? How are people working in the tourism industry affected? We can't just ask the questions, though. We have to bring hope for a better system to the table. We need a positive vision for something better. Repairing broken systems will never give us progress. And the best models for systems that work often exist. They are the systems of the place, made by the people who live there. Hawaii was not broken when it was colonized. Colonizing broke it. Am I saying that we should return to the 1800s? No. But we have to be smart enough to appreciate the wisdom of the people with a relationship to Hawaii. Kaniela says a community-based, feminist approach is instrumental in helping rebuild a Lahaina that could be more equitable than it was before the fires.
I mean, we're like almost there in terms of, not there in the goals, but like we're almost there at the point where community it has built power where they actually have a real say in how Lahaina is going to be rebuilt. And that's where our imaginations can run wild. Like if we had a schooling system or a policing system that wasn't patriarchal, what would that look like? And if we even want to begin to approach those answers, we really need to be empowering and giving women leaders the space to even like have those conversations. And not women leaders as in like business leaders, which is important, but people that, if you're in a community and you walk around, if you go door to door on a block and you say like, hey, like what's like one neighbor or someone in your church, like who would you go to if you had a problem or you didn't know what's going on? They don't always say the pastor. They don't always say like the most gregarious person in front of the room. They usually say like some random auntie. And like those are the people that we gotta like figure out how to resource and and lead the way following a disaster. And that's difficult. You have to be rooted and you have to find folks who are rooted and truly listen to them. But once you find those people and unlock their potential, then I think we'll really answer those questions. But of course, I'm not going to sit here on this podcast and try to answer those questions myself.
Lahaina is showing us a different path out of environmental catastrophes. Lahaina is showing us the importance of feminist and Native Hawaiian grassroots organizing to frame the issues correctly and name the true causes from the beginning. Lahaina draws our eye and forces us to look at the impact of colonization. Lahaina shows us how to fill the gaps in U.S. humanitarian response. Lahaina shows us the promise of a community in control. Short-term and political responses need to happen immediately and simultaneously in the wake of a disaster. This is how we get genuine environmental resilience in Hawaii. We opened our episode with the causes of the fires. Now, I'd like to look at the system of outreach and aid that was in place in the United States at the time. The response to the Lahaina fires exposed shortcomings in the U.S. disaster relief system. For example, major humanitarian organizations were inadequately structured and informed about the demographics and specific needs of Lahaina residents, which meant that vulnerable populations were not reached and unique cultural needs went unmet. Take the Filipino community. Filipinos are the second largest ethnic group on Maui.
At minimum, 40% of the population of Lahaina were Filipinos.
That's Nadine Ortega, a working-class Filipino immigrant to Hawaii, lawyer activist, and studied feminist who's the executive director of Tagnawa. It's a new environmental justice organization that responds to the needs of Filipinos affected by the fires.
And, that is largely due to the pattern of migration started through the targeting of Filipinos as a labor group to exploit by the Hawaii Sugar Plantation Association. They targeted Filipinos specifically and tried to incentivize them to come to Hawaii as another set of exploited labor.
That's right. We can trace things back once again to imperialism and sugar and pineapple. Even though the Filipino population is so large, some of the disaster experts, like the Red Cross, didn't know how to serve that community. I remember speaking to one Red Cross official who said they had no idea that most immigrants in Hawaii are Filipino. I thought they'd be Mexican, this person said. Oh well, at least they speak Spanish. For the record, less than 1% of Filipinos speak Spanish. The response was often, "Thank God you guys are here," referring to our ragtag volunteer group because they hadn't been able to gain trust with Filipinos. All the groups you'd expect to help, like state government, FEMA, American Red Cross, People's Fund Maui, also known as the Oprah Fund, United Way, they all needed weeks and weeks to set up shop and get their operations running smoothly in Lahaina. And when things did get running, many survivors couldn't get help because the U.S. disaster system is designed to be exclusionary to immigrants. I was on the ground watching their response slowly unfold. And in the days and weeks following, you could often find me at a bar in central Maui, ugly crying after outreach. I was helping groups like Tagnawa and Roots Reborn go to places where immigrants were sheltering to sign them up for assistance available to them or explain why they were ineligible for help. Having to turn people away will always stick with me. It was really hard when we knew them by name. One time we expected 50 people to show up, but then were met with a crowd of 800 very desperate people. We didn't know how to do crowd control in a humanitarian situation. We still beat ourselves up about that one. But ultimately, why were their needs not met? In our Filipino culture, adults don't beg or show weakness to younger people. Having so many Filipinos older than me, my parents' age, plead with me for money and help in tears felt like I was in the wrong place in the multiverse, like the world order flipped upside down. There was also a way we connected to Filipinos that was totally different than the Red Cross or FEMA. We used our in-group terms of endearment and signs of respect in our language, and survivors referred to us as their children. From all that, I realized that community-to-community disaster relief is a much more effective model because immigrants need to feel like the people helping them actually care about them. And from my perspective, they were not being humanized. Nadine was also unhappy with what she saw.
So immediately after the fire, you see all these funds being shared on social media where people could go and apply for them. But the people I knew in Maui, the survivors, some of them couldn't qualify for some of these funds because of their citizenship status, because they weren't the head of household. They were part of this multi-generational family where only one person could qualify. Language barrier is another issue. And then my family, their house burned down, their 2 cars burnt down, but they were recent immigrants. And so they didn't have a bank account. And so they couldn't access that immediate funneling of money. I was talking to all of these organizations and I was asking them, is there anything that you guys are going to do? And they pretty much said, we are going to leave it to these larger groups who are more established. But I was not satisfied with that.
Nadine served as the de facto unpaid Filipino translator for many community serving organizations doing disaster response, and even helped official government agencies during the first weeks after the fire, translating urgent issuances into Ilocano. She was the first person, and for weeks the only person, to coordinate and organize an explicitly Filipino response for affected immigrants. But even then, Nadine felt more could be done to help Filipinos. So she founded Tagnawa for Maui, Tagnawa for short.
Tagnawa means reciprocity. It's a methodology and a practice and way of thinking about the world. It's kind of, we help each other. This is rooted in Ilocano worldview, where the individual is not separate from the collective, and that uplifting everyone kind of grows and allows everybody to thrive.
Tagnawa is a feminist organization, but she doesn't subscribe to the practice or the idea that issues can be tackled in isolation when you live on a small, occupied island in the Pacific. She also disagrees with the characterization of Filipinos and immigrants as rootless people who don't care about the environment. In fact, Tagnawa was the first group to document mental health issues related to the fire's destruction of home gardens, which caused immigrants to lose access to Filipino vegetables and the food they're used to eating. Nadine rapidly organized a group of volunteers to go out and do needs assessment surveys. And what happened next is a powerful example of why it's important for any group that does relief work to adopt a feminist lens.
One way that Tagnawa paid attention to and considered the needs of women specifically was adding a gender question to our needs assessment, because we needed to know some of the distinct ways that women were struggling post-fire. And so we asked a question about safety, whether or not they felt safe in their household, because we have high rates of domestic violence in the Filipino community in Hawaii. And so nobody was paying attention to that specific issue post-fire. And in our survey, we actually found that there was a number of women who responded that they actually did not feel safe. And so that's something that we tried to pay particular attention to that needed to be addressed.
Crisis after crisis has shown that extreme forms of violence against women and girls increase following environmental disasters. I'm going to give you some numbers, and they are shocking. When Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, women were about half of the population, but they made up 80% of those left behind after the mandatory evacuation. The year after that, the rate of gender-based violence toward displaced women in Mississippi rose more than threefold. So I wish it were more surprising that domestic violence doubled in the immediate aftermath of the Lahaina fires. But this is a pattern anyone looking at the evidence could have predicted. And yet, the U.S. humanitarian system doesn't adequately address women's specific needs during and after crises. FEMA didn't make a public awareness announcement about domestic violence resources until over 3 months after the Lahaina fires. The only other sign of a gender violence response from a major humanitarian organization that I personally saw in Lahaina was one flyer for a domestic violence hotline posted on a wall in a hotel lobby. While local women's organizations on Maui should be lauded for stepping up, it's important to emphasize that their staff was directly affected by the fires themselves. So local groups can't be reasonably expected to take full responsibility for coordination on gender-based violence during a live catastrophe. Major disaster organizations who do this full-time and for decades should have done better on gender, and they certainly have the funding to. Grassroots women organizers know their communities best and understand their needs. They are who immigrants trust the most. They are the ones immigrants will not hide from or avoid amid disasters. They are also the ones who often miss out on the boom in fundraising during environmental catastrophes and humanitarian crises, because that is how the system was designed.
Everything that we did in the beginning were funded by our own money, our own personal desire to help. Eventually, we were told people wanted to give us money to help us with the work, but we were an incorporated organization of just volunteers, and they couldn't essentially give us funding. So that was a challenge. And we were able to ask another nonprofit to be our fiscal sponsor. That took a while to establish. And then we applied for some of these fundings, and we were able to secure some grants at the end of last year. And that we kind of had to also learn to do on our own. I met with people. I've never done that before. Meetings with funders to talk about Tagnawa and what we do.
When an organization secures funding to serve the direct needs of a community, that's great. But what's also needed is support for systemic policy and leadership change. Organizations like Tagnawa face limitations on what they can do to affect changes at a larger level. After the fires, the state of Hawaii selectively targeted progressive political fundraising efforts, alleging misuse of disaster response funds, even when the groups were upfront to donors about using funds for long-term political work. This reflects a concerning bias, undermines system change, and maintains status quo philanthropy.
There is a kind of limitation put on the taking of this money, because you can only spend, I'm not sure the exact number, like 10% of your work doing advocacy and legislative work. And I think that's the crux of the issue that I think really needs to be reanalyzed, because it dampens the work.
Despite the opposition, the Lahaina community's continued plight and sophisticated organizing are making system change popular. Remember in episode 1, when we talked about how you have to afflict the comfortable in order to comfort the afflicted? It's happening here in Hawaii too. Lahaina Strong, the movement led by and for Maui fire survivors, has been serving the community in a true bottom-up process and has been willing to leverage disruptive power. They're physically occupying the main tourist beach in West Maui until government officials provide them with dignified long-term housing. It's grounded in aloha, but it's confrontational. It's demanding. It's disrupting business. It's working. This has resulted in surprising political support and even prioritization at the state legislature for major shifts in how Hawaii manages housing and water. What strategies can we take from Lahaina for the next crisis? While there isn't a singular playbook, we can incorporate better ways to think about how our philanthropy works today. We can use disaster response to confront patriarchy. How? We focus support to solutions that disrupt sexist and racist norms, which means we trust communities to know their needs better than outsiders. We recognize the domino effect between wealth accumulation, climate collapse, and women's status. And when these patriarchal systems are showing their dysfunction, we will capitalize on it in a way that accelerates gender equality. Disasters are always political. You can call them natural or man-made. You can call a war self-defense or offense. That choice is political. And who is allowed to shape it and how is sometimes criminalized. Join us next week as we explore shadowy US-based policy barriers that make it difficult to fund root cause work and are even criminalizing gender equality efforts. We'll investigate why policy change beyond, quote, traditional women's issues must be a priority. Thank you for listening to Feminist by Design, a podcast brought to you by the Global Center for Gender Equality. I'm your host, Khara Jabola-Carolus. This show was created, executive produced, and written by Maggie Hellis and me. Producing, sound design, and mixing by Elizabeth Nakano. Narrative editing and development by Arwen Nix. Special research and production by Erica Fotheringham. Cover art by Maggie Hellis. To learn more about the Global Center for Gender Equality, check out our show notes.